The top stars in boxing can make almost 100 times what a UFC champion makes. Seriously. Unless you're a super popular UFC champion, the pay isn't great.
According to my pay, I don't mean to the UFC.
While at the height of their careers, the top-earning boxers can comfortably make over $50 million per fight. The huge split has led to antitrust lawsuits, fighters quitting while champion, and other companies trying to make both sports more like each other. So the big question is, how is this disparity so large, and why has it happened? It wasn't until 2016 when the UFC gave their first guaranteed $1 million payday, and of course, it went to Conor McGregor. But Conor was in a league of his own amongst UFC fighters. Nate Diaz, who actually beat him that evening at UFC 196, reportedly earned only half that. But Miesha Tate, one part of the co-main event, her contract was a measly $46,000 to show and $46,000 to win. And while she may not have been the biggest name, Miesha was the Strikeforce champion, a coach on The Ultimate Fighter, and had already fought for the UFC title before. It was the UFC's best-selling pay-per-view of all time at this point. But in comparison, Amir Khan fought Canelo Alvarez just a couple of months later. The event sold around half as many pay-per-views as UFC 196, but Khan reportedly earned $2 million, with Canelo's purse being $3.5 million. And as you move to more recent times, those numbers are blown out of the water. Take Usyk vs Fury 1. According to sources online, Tyson Fury made an absurd amount of money.
He's definitely going to make $100 million for the two fights, but I've heard there's a third fight as well, you know, and a locked-in rematch. But I don't know, but huge amounts of money obviously out there, and that's the reason he's taking a fight.
But a few weeks prior, it was UFC 300, arguably the biggest event in MMA history. The headliner, Alex Pereira, reportedly made $2.8 million, with Jamal Hill barely hitting $500,000. Former champions like Davison Figueiredo and Aljamain Sterling earned around $250,000. If you combine the entire payout for UFC 300, Tyson Fury probably earned 10 times that by himself. And just remember, you had UFC veterans and champions freaking out because Dana White increased the bonus to $300K.
Both guys want bonuses raised from $50K for the special card. Can we make this happen?
What should it be raised to?
3 times.
100,000.
300, go 3 times.
300.
300! 300!
300, it's done.
Let's go!
Let's go!
Yet, speaking of Dana, whenever he talks about boxing, he makes it seem like the UFC is beating it at every turn. But UFC fighters are constantly calling out boxers and trying to find a way to earn more money. So if the UFC is so superior, why is this pay split so enormous? The most obvious reasons are how entirely different the UFC and boxing are structured. In the UFC, you have one single entity with a near complete monopoly on the sport.
This is the most dangerous sport in the world, and the UFC, makes billions of dollars a year, and they're only paying their fighters 15% of that. Ari Emanuel, the CEO of Endeavor, his salary last year was more than the entire UFC roster. So these fighters are risking their lives for $10,000. There's no long-term health care. So for me, I just saw it as a problem, and I am one of the people who can use my platform to speak up about it, because a lot of fighters in the UFC are scared to say something because Dana can just shelf them.
The UFC calls the shots. They dictate how much revenue they're willing to give their fighters, when they'll fight, and who against. And if you don't like it, well, Dana White will just say you can leave or go start your own promotion instead.
And the end of the day is, this is my company. Who the fuck are you to tell me how to pay my people?
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, there's no barrier to entry. Go start your own MMA organization and pay them whatever you want.
And although exploring free agency has worked in the past, it's extremely rare. As a UFC fighter, you're an independent contractor with very little rights, and unless you're a significant draw, you have essentially no leverage. Even UFC champions get pressured to say yes to the company. In a now-deleted YouTube video, former bantamweight champion Aljamain Sterling admitted he felt pressured and coerced by the higher-ups at the UFC to accept a quick turnaround fight against Sean O'Malley because of money. You'd never hear a boxing world champion saying they felt pressured by their bosses to accept a fight, because the boxing world is run almost completely opposite to the UFC. There's numerous organizations, different promoters, and if you're a star, you hold all the power. You have a major say in who you fight, when and where it takes place, how the money is going to be split up, and essentially everything else. And if the two fighters can't come to an agreement, there isn't a powerful boss behind them pressuring them into saying yes. They have the freedom to just decline and take their business elsewhere.
We got to say, if a fighter really wants to make the fight happen, then they'll press to make it happen. But fighters will just use the excuse of their promoter or network or something like that. And sometimes it's true. I'm not saying that it's always the case, but for the most part, we need to try to control our own destiny, try to control our own careers. You know what I'm saying? We're not under an organization like the NFL or like NBA or nothing like that. Like, we have the say, we just don't, express it enough.
The difference is, the UFC banks the money they earn. They invest into huge shows like The Sphere, create The Ultimate Fighter, and have hundreds, if not thousands of employees to pay.
I'm very happy with what we've accomplished and what we've done and what we continue to do, not just for the fighters, but for our employees who work here at the UFC. We continue to grow the sport. We continue to get more people involved from other countries. And we reinvest in the sport.
But for boxing, no one works for boxing. When they put on an event, every dollar earned ends up in someone's pocket.
Every fucking event that they put on, it's a going out of business sale. Let's grab as much money as we can from everybody. We don't care if the event is good. We don't care if the people at home enjoy what they saw. We don't care if the people who came and bought tickets liked it. We just want to grab as much money as we can. They never reinvested in the sport. Tell me a sport or any business ever in the history of the world that has probably made trillions of dollars in revenue, and at the end of the day, there's nothing there. That's boxing.
And that's why reportedly the UFC gives around 16% of its revenue to the athletes, whereas for a boxing event, that number is usually closer to 50%. It's why UFC fighters are desperate to make the leap into the squared circle. They all want to fight Jake Paul, Kamaru Usman called out Canelo, but one of the very few who has truly made a successful go at it is Francis Ngannou. He gave up the UFC's heavyweight title, tested free agency, and Dana White was convinced it was going to be a disaster.
Francis just thinks that he's in a position where he's got some Conor McGregor-Mayweather fight on his hands, which he does not. That fight was like a once-in-a-lifetime type deal.
But in his two fights against Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, reports say he earned around $30 million combined. For reference, his purse was just $600,000 for his final UFC fight. In fact, he reportedly made less than $4 million across all 14 of his UFC appearances. But this is because the sports are entirely different, and it has some serious ramifications. For the UFC, at least from a fan's perspective, it's incredible. The best almost always fight the best. There's a clear ranking system to follow, and for most people, there's only one promotion to watch. It's pretty easy to be an MMA or UFC fan, but for the fighters, well, it's far from ideal and it's caused a lot of backlash.
I actually have more of a problem with what the higher level guys get or don't get, right? i.e., a percentage of the pay-per-view, a bigger percentage of the pay-per-view, a bigger percentage of the revenue share, a bigger percentage of the gate, all that stuff.
It led to hundreds of former UFC fighters teaming up to try and take on the UFC in a decade-long antitrust lawsuit that only recently got settled. Whereas for boxing, it's pretty much the opposite. They argue about how the revenue is getting split up, what size the ring is, who the judges are, and who walks out last and everything in between.
And sometimes you get two fighters who go, Chris, I am not taking less than 55%. And Conor, there is no way I'm taking a fight unless it's 50-50. And sometimes that's the reality of the people that you deal with.
Sometimes fights happen 5 years after they should have happened. Yet when they finally sort their differences out, the elite fighters get paid enormous amounts for their troubles. For boxing and MMA, that's the way it's always been for decades. But now, two huge entities have come into each sport and are looking to shake up the entire business models.
What is the Global Fight League?
So we're launching 6 global teams, 4 different continents, and we're launching our proof of concept season starting in April. We have multiple venues booked in multiple different cities around the world. We're embracing our flexibility to begin with and doing that 50-50 revenue share, the team versus team, proof of concept season, and it's finally lined up. We have 300 fighters signed as of right now. Our draft is January 24th. On those 6 teams, there's 20 athletes per each roster, so we'll sign 120 of the actual fighters that have signed, and then we'll get underway with events in April.
A new MMA promotion has recently emerged looking to eventually rival the UFC. They've signed a giant roster filled with UFC veterans, are promising a 50-50 revenue split with the fighters, and claim to support them into retirement.
Some of the top 50: Woodley, Verdun, Pettis, Alexei Oleinik, JDS, Hector Lombard, Luke Rockhold, Abubakar Nurmagomedov, Vanderlei Silva, Alex Gustafsson, the former UFC title contender. There's more: Thiago Santos, Andre Arlovski, Lucas Martins, Gabriel Souza, Kevin Lee, Frank Mir, B. Nguyen, Charles Rosa, Alan Belcher. These are of the top 50 followed. Ilia Latifi, Jeremy Stevens, Marlon Moraes, Benson Henderson, all these guys, Gegard Mousasi, all these guys are on board.
All these guys are signed.
We've seen MMA organizations promising the world to fighters in the past, only to disappear after a few years, so no one really knows how GFL will perform. But I can guarantee a lot of people currently under contract with the UFC will have their eyes on it, because the recent antitrust lawsuit ended in a $375 million settlement, which may sound like a significant sum of money the UFC had to pay out, but it isn't in the grand scheme of things. But it ultimately meant that the UFC can keep their fighters' contracts the same way going forward and keep them as independent contractors with very little freedom. On boxing side though, we've already seen a huge shakeup.
There is 4 company, 4 belt.
So many problems.
So many problems, you know, and you need to catch the youngest generation now.
Yeah.
You need to have good poster, good music, good show. You understand?
Good trailers.
DJ, you know, you understand me? Good promotion. Use a lot of cameras, use a lot of things. Similar to what UFC now do. They do it right because they are company, and they are all the only company.
With Saudi's influence on boxing, all of a sudden these mega fights and stacked cards are being made almost seamlessly. They have so much money that both fighters are happy to accept whatever terms are in front of them, completely sidestepping all those pre-fight politics. But the Saudis want to go one further.
I'm going to get the 50 best fighters in every weight division. I'm going to pay you more money than anywhere else. You can still be with Eddie at Matchroom. You can still be with Frank at Queensbury. You can still be with Oscar at Golden Boy if you so desire. But you fight under our umbrella only.
They're planning on creating a single boxing league, with 1 title per division and 1 ranking system. It's essentially the UFC model. Who knows how successful either MMA's new promotion or Saudi boxing will be, although competition is good for all. But for now, that enormous pay disparity between MMA fighters and boxers isn't changing anytime soon.